They thought killing a gang leader would silence the streets, but they forgot one thing: you can never erase the voice of the ones left behind. When 23-year-old Malik Big Blood Johnson, the unchallenged leader of the Westside Kings, is gunned down by the police in a so-called routine stop, the department calls it justified. They say he reached for a weapon, but there's no footage, no body cams, just the word of two officers against the lifeless body of a man whose name the city was too quick to forget. In the streets, Malik wasn't just a leader. He was a brother, a father, a protector, and when the cops pulled the trigger, they ignited a war they weren't prepared for. The Westside Kings weren't a gang to fear, but a family to fight for. They never feared the system, not the law, not the lies, and certainly not the police who thought they were untouchable. The officers who believed they could get away with murder thought they'd quashed the rebellion before it could begin, but they didn't realize that every bullet they fired would be met with 100 more unspoken promises of vengeance. The Westside Kings had been silenced for too long. Now, under the leadership of Malik's younger brother, Darnell Lil Blood Johnson, the streets would fight back, and this time, it wouldn't be with guns or fists. It would be with a cold, calculated silence, a movement built not on chaos, but precision. They declared war, not just on the cops, but on the system that had protected them. And this time, there would be no hiding the truth, the city thought. They could kill Malik, but they underestimated what the streets could really do. The Westside Kings weren't fighting for territory anymore. They were fighting for justice. The city streets are alive with the hum of activity, but a darker energy hangs in the air. The moment is quiet yet heavy with sorrow as Malik Big Blood Johnson's death sends shockwaves through the neighborhood. The image should show a dimly lit street corner with a group of people gathered in a tense silence, their faces showing a mix of disbelief, anger, and grief. In the background, a makeshift memorial for Malik sits, a few candles flickering and a photo of him pinned to a nearby wall. Graffiti that reads "Rip Big Blood" is scrawled across the brick walls, symbolizing the community's anger and mourning. The distant sirens of police cars can be heard faintly, their flashing lights barely visible at the edge of the street, symbolizing the ever-present tension. Character specifications. Malik Big Blood Johnson, though not present in the scene, physically, his spirit is felt through the gathered community. His presence is represented in the photo and graffiti. Community members, a diverse group of black men and women, some in their 20s to 40s, dressed in casual urban clothing. Their expressions are serious, with many of them holding their phones, staring at the news or sharing hushed words. Some have raised fists, while others stand silently, reflecting a quiet but united defiance. Setting: a dark city street corner, bathed in the glow of dim streetlights. Broken sidewalks, worn buildings, and a light mist in the air give the atmosphere a sense of lingering unease. The faint echo of distant sirens and the hum of the city's normal rhythm contrast with the heaviness of grief and rage that the community now carries. The scene captures the calm before the storm, as the community prepares to rise in the face of the unjust loss of their leader. And the worst part, they had no intentions of making it right. Not the police, not the system that protected them. No, they would sweep it under the rug like they had so many others. Malik was just another statistic to them, another black man in a hoodie with a criminal record. But to the people who grew up under his leadership, he was a brother, a father figure. He was more than just a man, he was a symbol. And now, that symbol was gone, taken by the very people who were supposed to protect the community. The sirens were still echoing in the air when Lil Blood Johnson, Malik's younger brother, walked out of his apartment, his eyes blank but burning with something unspoken. It had been 2 hours since they told him, but the shock hadn't worn off yet. He was still numb, still trying to process the flood of anger and grief that surged inside him. Jay was used to the violence. He had grown up on the streets, surrounded by it, lived through more than his fair share of gunshots and closed caskets. But this was different. This was his brother. Jay had always followed Malik's lead. He wasn't the one who jumped into every fight, who made the loudest noise or drew the most attention. That was Malik's role. Jay was the quiet one, the one who kept his head down and did the work. He was the one who handled the behind-the-scenes stuff, the logistics, the planning. It was why they called him Lil Blood, not because he was some tough guy, but because he understood how to move in silence, how to get things done without making a spectacle. He wasn't like the others in the gang, always looking for the next fight or the next shot. He was smart, calculated, and that's what made him the perfect second in command. But now, with Malik gone, everything was different. DJ's hands were shaking as he stepped out into the cool night air. His breath came in short bursts, the weight of the world pressing down on his chest. His brother, the one man he had always looked up to, the one man who had taught him how to survive in this broken city, was dead. And now, Jay didn't know what to do with himself. His phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him out of the fog of disbelief. He pulled it out, eyes scanning the screen. It was a message from one of Malik's old crew members, one of the lieutenants who had worked alongside Malik for years. It was simple, just a name. "We moving, right now." Jay didn't need to ask any questions. He knew exactly what it meant. The whole city was already buzzing with rage. The streets were alive with whispers, rumors of retaliation, of revenge. It wasn't just the kings who were mourning Malik, it was everyone. People from the neighborhood were talking, and not in the way they usually did. This wasn't some run-of-the-mill street beef. This was different. Malik's death wasn't just a death, it was a statement, and now, that statement had to be answered. Jay's mind raced, but his body moved without hesitation. His footsteps echoed in the hallways of the apartment complex. As he made his way down to the street, the sounds of the city didn't comfort him tonight. They felt like a reminder that everything was wrong. That the system, the same system that had taken Malik from him, would never change. The same system that protected the cops who shot him. The same system that had been built to break men like Malik and, now, break him too. He reached the corner of the block, where a few of Malik's closest associates were already waiting. No one spoke. They didn't need to. The message was clear. They had lost their leader, their family, but they were going to make the world feel it. There was a sense of unity now, but it was the kind of unity forged in tragedy. It wasn't the way they wanted to come together, but it was the way it had to be. Jay didn't say a word as he approached the car. He slid into the front seat, eyes staring ahead, blank but burning. The others piled in behind him, each of them quiet, each of them knowing what was coming. There would be no speeches, no grand plans. No, this wasn't the time for words. This was the time for action. The engine rumbled to life, the sound of it filling the quiet streets as they rolled out. The world outside was dark, the streets empty. The car moved through the neighborhood with a purpose, but there was no speed to it. It wasn't a chase. It was a slow march, one that had started the moment Malik had died, and Jay knew it. The cops had made a fatal mistake thinking they could kill one of them without consequence. They had made the mistake of thinking they could silence the streets. The ride was silent. The kind of silence that makes everything feel heavier, like you're waiting for something inevitable to happen. Jay's thoughts drifted back to Malik. He could see his brother's face clearly in his mind, his smile, the way he moved through the city with a sense of control, of power. He had always been the one to protect the family, to take the risks so others didn't have to. Malik had always made it look easy, but Jay knew it wasn't. He knew how much his brother had sacrificed to keep everyone safe, to keep the gang's power intact, and now, it was all falling apart. Jay's mind snapped back to the present as the car came to a stop. He knew what they had to do. He wasn't sure he was ready for it, but he didn't have a choice anymore. The plan had already been set in motion. Malik had been the face of the kings, the one who had made the deals, who had kept things in balance. But now, Jay was the one leading them, and with Malik gone, Jay knew that he had no choice but to take control, to do what had to be done. The weight of the situation crashed down on him again as he stepped out of the car, the cold night air hitting his face. He didn't know how long they could keep this up, but he knew one thing for sure. The war had just begun, that the cops had made their move, and now Jay and the kings would make theirs. The system had broken them, but it wasn't going to break them. Again, not this time. The silence in the air was deafening, but Jay knew that it wouldn't stay silent for long, not when they were done with it. The night was alive with tension, thick like the fog rolling off the river, but nothing could have prepared the city for what was about to unfold. The streets were quiet, unusually so for a Monday night. A few scattered cars cruised down the main avenues, their headlights cutting through the mist. In the distance, the faint hum of a passing train echoed. But in that moment, everything seemed to hold its breath. Malik Big Blood Johnson was used to moving through the city like this. He'd been a part of the West Side Kings for as long as anyone could remember. His name was known by nearly everyone in the city. But it wasn't his reputation as a gangster that made him powerful. It was his ability to remain calm, collected, and focused. His success wasn't about grand gestures or flashy displays of power. It was about control, and control meant keeping your head, especially in moments like this. He had been pulled over a dozen times before. The cops always seemed to be watching him, pulling him aside, trying to bait him into something they could use against him. It was just part of life in the city. But tonight, there was something different about the stop. It didn't feel like the usual dance between law enforcement and someone with a record. This felt like they were waiting for something. It felt like they wanted this to go wrong. The flashing lights were the first sign of trouble. Red and blue strobes reflected off the wet pavement, sending shards of light slicing through the otherwise dark street. The sirens wailed, their shrill noise cutting through the cool night air like a warning. Malik's car, a blacked-out Chevy Impala, coasted to the side of the street, the engine dying with a soft, final thud. He was alone, as usual. No crew, no backup, just Malik, his thoughts, and the streetlights that seemed to watch him like they always did. He reached up and switched off the music, a low hum of bass fading into silence. Malik wasn't nervous. He wasn't scared. He was used to this. He knew the drill. Hands on the wheel. No sudden movements. He knew how to survive moments like these. Two officers stepped out of their cruiser. One went to the driver's side, the other circled around to the passenger side. Malik's eyes remained forward, his fingers gripping the steering wheel. His chest rose and fell with steady breaths. He knew they were looking for an excuse, just like they always did. But he had made it this far by not giving them one. The officer on his side leaned down, his face obscured by the glare of the headlights. The other officer was still walking around the back of the car, flashlights sweeping across the street. License and registration. The officer called out, his voice cold, impersonal. Malik's hands didn't shake as he slowly reached into the glove compartment. His movements were deliberate. His calm was unwavering. He pulled out the registration and handed it over without saying a word. The officer took it, his fingers brushing Malik's. A brief contact that felt like more than just the exchange of papers. The officer didn't say anything for a moment. There was a slight pause, and for a second the tension seemed to heighten, like they were waiting for something to crack. The officer glanced at Malik. His eyes weren't the usual accusatory stare. There was something else in them, something darker. Suddenly the radio crackled. Backups on the way, just in case. Malik's mind raced, but his face remained a mask of composure. He knew this wasn't going to be a routine stop anymore. The officer shifted his weight, his hand inching toward his weapon. That was the moment Malik knew. They were waiting for him to make a move. They wanted him to react. They wanted to say he was a threat. But Malik knew how to play it. He had to. He had been trained for moments like this. His breath hitched in his chest, but only for a second. His fingers wrapped tighter around the steering wheel. He kept his eyes forward, his voice even when he spoke. What's this really about? The officer didn't answer. Instead, his hand moved quicker than Malik had anticipated, pulling his gun from the holster. The motion was swift, practiced, too quick. In that split second, everything went wrong. The second officer, who had been circling the car, shouted, "He's reaching, he's reaching." The officer on Malik's side raised his weapon. Malik didn't move. His hand remained on the wheel, steady, refusing to give them the satisfaction. But that wasn't enough. The sound of the shot echoed like a thunderclap in the street, followed by another. The first bullet hit Malik in the chest. The second found its mark in his throat. His body jerked violently before slumping against the door. The car's interior was flooded with the warm, thick scent of blood as it began to pool beneath him. The officers stood over him for a long moment, their guns still drawn, their eyes scanning the interior as though expecting him to spring back to life. But the life was gone. It had been taken from him in an instant. He hadn't even had a chance to speak, to explain, to defend himself. "Backups here," one officer muttered as they stepped away from the vehicle. They didn't even bother checking for a pulse. The radio crackled again. The voice on the other end barely carried any emotion as they confirmed what had already been done. Officer-involved shooting. Suspect down. All clear. The officers didn't even flinch. They had done their job. And, as far as they were concerned, that was that. But for everyone who had known Malik, for his family, for his crew, for the streets that ran through his veins, this was only the beginning. The aftermath of death didn't come in the form of loud protests or chaotic outbursts. Not at first, anyway, no. The real response came quietly, in the whispers that began to spread through the neighborhood. People were talking, but they weren't talking to the cops. They were talking to each other, passing the news through phone calls, text messages, and face-to-face conversations. The rumors spread like wildfire, but the fire didn't burn hot at first. It smoldered, it simmered beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to erupt. When Lil Blood Johnson heard about his brother's death, he didn't know how to process it. He'd known that one day this might happen, that this city would try to take something from him. But to have it be Malik, the person who had taught him how to survive the streets, how to lead, how to stay calm when everything else was falling apart, that was more than he could handle. The news came to him on a quiet Tuesday morning. A text from one of Malik's old crew members. Malik's gone. Cops killed him last night. They're calling it justified. JJ's heart seemed to stop for a moment. He couldn't breathe. He didn't understand. It didn't make sense. Malik wasn't the kind of man to die like this. He wasn't the kind of man who got caught in a mess that could end like this. The words echoed in his mind as he stared at the phone. They're calling it justified. But Jay knew better. Jay knew what it meant. They didn't just kill his brother. They killed something bigger. They killed the hope that maybe, just maybe, they could change things. They killed the man who had stood up against the system, who had made sure the kings were untouchable. And now, that same system was walking away free. Jay's first reaction wasn't grief. It wasn't sadness. It was anger. White-hot boiling rage. The kind of rage that burned so deep it was like fire running through his veins. He wanted to pick up a gun, to start shooting, to make someone pay for taking Malik from him. He could hear the voices in the streets already, the cries for retaliation, for justice through violence. But that wasn't what his brother would have wanted. Malik had never been about mindless violence. Malik had always believed in precision and control. But how do you control something this big? How do you hold yourself together when the one person who kept you grounded is suddenly gone? Jay didn't know. He didn't know what to do. All he knew was that the streets were going to react, and he had to be a part of it. He had to lead them, not with a gun, but with something else, something bigger, because the cops thought they had one, but Jay wasn't going to let them get away with it. Not this time. But deep inside, Jay was fighting something worse than the cops. He was fighting himself, his grief, his anger, and the realization that he might never get his brother back, and that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't the same person he was before. This was just the beginning, and Jay knew it. The streets would speak soon, and when they did, it wouldn't be a whisper. It would be a roar that would shake the city to its core. The weight of Malik's death was like a dark cloud hanging over the West Side Kings. It wasn't just that they had lost their leader, their brother, it was that they had lost the very thing that had kept them going. Malik had been their spine, the one who kept them straight, the one who always had a plan. Without him, they were like an army without a general, a ship adrift in stormy waters. The anger was palpable, thickening the air, in every corner of their neighborhood. But more than that, it was a sense of betrayal that hung over them, gnawing away at their insides. J. Lil Blood Johnson felt it more than anyone. The streets were already filled with whispers of retaliation, and the phantoms, Malik's crew, were coming together. Jay knew they would want revenge, but he also knew that revenge wasn't always the answer. His brother had been calculated, precise in every move. Malik had taught him that. He had always chosen to strike when it would hurt the most, when it would make a real difference. Jay wasn't sure if he could live up to that. He wasn't sure if he wanted to anymore. The night after Malik's funeral, Jay sat alone in his apartment, his thoughts swirling like a storm inside his head. His phone buzzed on the table, pulling him from his thoughts. Another message from one of Malik's lieutenants. K-Dub, we ready, Jay? What's the move? Jay stared at the screen, fingers hovering over the keys. What was the move? He didn't know anymore. His mind told him to think, to plan like Malik would have. But his heart was filled with rage, and every part of him wanted to lash out, to take the system down piece by piece. That's what the streets wanted. They wanted blood. They wanted vengeance. They wanted the kind of violence that would make the city tremble. He ran his hands through his hair and let out a long sigh. He couldn't do it. Not like this. Malik had always told him, you strike when it matters. You move when the moment's right. The words echoed in Jay's mind. He closed his eyes, trying to feel the weight of his brother's wisdom, trying to remember the calm that Malik had always brought to situations like this. But all he could feel was anger, sharp and biting. The decision he faced wasn't just about what kind of revenge they would take, it was about who he was going to be. Was he going to follow his brother's footsteps and fight with precision, or was he going to be like the others, letting rage dictate every move? But the longer he sat there in the silence of his apartment, the more it became clear that he didn't have the luxury of hesitation. The phantoms were waiting for him. The streets were watching, too. They had already lost their leader. They weren't about to lose their dignity, their pride, their sense of family. And Jay knew that the longer he waited, the more his own crew would start to question him. That night, Jay made the call. He picked up his phone, his fingers trembling as he dialed the number he had been avoiding. It was time. The phantoms were a family, and they needed to move. But this time, it would be different. It wouldn't be mindless violence. It couldn't be. Malik wouldn't have wanted that. Jay wouldn't dishonor his brother's memory like that. The phone rang once, twice, and then K-Dub answered. Jay, K-Dub said, his voice low. the weight of the past few days heavy in his words. What's the word? We ready? Jay paused. For a long moment, he didn't want to sound uncertain, but he wasn't sure he could hide it anymore. We need a meeting, he said, his voice steady but carrying a depth of emotion that he hadn't allowed himself to show before. All of us, no speeches, no promises, just one thing. Understood, K-Dub replied. We're with you. Jay, whatever you decide. Jay didn't say anything else. He hung up the phone, his hands clenched at his sides. He knew what had to be done, but he didn't know how to carry it out. Not yet. But the decision was made. There would be no turning back. The meeting took place in an abandoned warehouse on the edge of the west side. It was a place they'd used for years, far enough from the eyes of the city, but close enough to the heart of their territory. The air was thick with tension as the phantoms gathered, their faces hard, their bodies tense. There were no words spoken when Jay entered the room. The crew knew this wasn't a time for pleasantries. They were here for one reason, and one reason only, to decide what came next. Jay stood at the front of the room, his eyes sweeping over the crew. They were all there, K-Dub, Fat Mike, Lil T, the whole crew. Each of them had their own part to play in the kingdom Malik had built. But without Malik there was no kingdom. There was no leadership. For the first time, Jay felt the weight of that responsibility. Malik had led them with calm, with focus. He had never been swayed by emotion, never let the violence get the best of him. But here, in this moment, Jay wasn't sure if he could hold on to that same calm. His brother was dead, and he was angry. He wanted to strike back. He wanted to make the cops feel the same fear they had put into the people of the West Side for years. But as he looked around at the crew, at the faces of the people who had followed Malik, Jay realized something. This wasn't about him. It wasn't about what he wanted. It was about what they all needed. And what they needed wasn't chaos. It wasn't rage. It was justice. We're going to war, Jay said, his voice cutting through the room like a knife. There was no pause, no hesitation, no question. Every single phantom in the room knew what that meant. They had all been waiting for this moment, waiting for Jay to lead them. But Jay wasn't done yet. But not the way they expect us to. This isn't going to be about shooting up the block. It's not going to be about running around like fools, letting the cops pick us off one by one. This is going to be about precision. This is going to be about making them feel what they've done. And it's going to be about making sure the system feels it too. We're not just fighting for revenge, we're fighting for what's right. The room was silent. Everyone was listening. Everyone understood. Jay's words weren't just a call to action. They were a declaration. A declaration that they weren't just going to be victims. They weren't going to roll over and let the system swallow them whole. This wasn't about taking down the police. This was about taking down the system that had protected them for too long. We move fast, we move smart, and we move together, Jay continued, his voice steady now, more sure of himself. We make them see us. We make them feel every single piece of this. And we take it to them, not with bullets and violence, but with something far worse. We expose them. We show the city who they really are. It was a dangerous path to walk. Jay knew that. But as he stood in front of the phantoms, looking at their faces, he realized that this was the only way. They needed to make a statement, not just to the police, but to the entire city. They were a force, and they weren't going to be ignored any longer. We're going to war, Jay repeated, his voice louder now, stronger, and we're going to win. With that, the crew stood, their eyes locked on Jay, their resolve firm. They were ready to follow him, ready to follow Malik's legacy, ready to show the system that they weren't going to back down. Jay had made his choice. He had decided the path forward, but even as he spoke those words, he knew the cost. This wouldn't be easy, it wouldn't be clean, but it would be necessary. And as he looked around at the faces of his crew, he realized something else. It wasn't just about vengeance, it was about their survival. And in the streets of the West Side, survival meant more than just living. It meant taking control. They weren't just going to fight the cops. They were going to tear the whole system down. And this time, no one was going to stop them. The war had begun. The phantoms had been operating in silence, a quiet storm in the heart of the city. It wasn't chaos that they sought. It wasn't random violence. What the phantoms needed, what Jay needed, was precision. Each move they made, every action they took, was calculated with the kind of cold deliberation that Malik had taught them all to embody. They were no longer just a gang. They were a force, and they had come to remind the city of one undeniable truth. The streets could be louder than the system. Jay's leadership was tested every single day. His decisions, his quiet strategy, everything that had once been Malik's domain, now rested on his shoulders. At first he had hesitated. At first he didn't know if he could carry the weight, but with each passing day, each passing action, Jay realized something about himself. He wasn't the same person he had been before. And now, there was no turning back. The first strike came not with a roar, but with a whisper. It came in the form of a series of anonymous tips, leaks, and documents carefully placed evidence that would turn the spotlight back onto the police. No shots were fired. No explosions rocked the streets. Instead, the phantoms had planted their seeds, invisible yet potent, waiting for the right moment to bloom. It began with Officer Raymond Carson. Carson was known in the precinct as a tough cop, someone who wasn't afraid to step on a few heads to climb higher. He had a reputation for brutality, for planting evidence on black teens and bending the law in ways that made the department look the other way. Carson thought he was untouchable, a man above reproach. That was the first mistake. Jay had learned everything he could about Carson, his habits, his schedule, his vices. It wasn't hard to find his weak points. Officers like Carson were predictable, their corruption woven into the very fabric of their careers. They thought they could get away with it because they had the system on their side, but the phantoms didn't need the system. They had something else. Leverage. Carson's routine was simple, too simple. Every night after his shift, he would grab a drink at a small bar near the precinct, a dive where the regulars didn't ask questions. It was there that the phantoms made their move. K-Dub, one of Malik's most trusted men, had been watching Carson for weeks. He knew when he would be vulnerable, when he would be alone. The phantoms didn't need brute force to take him down. They needed a plan. That night, Carson left the bar a little drunk, his judgment clouded by alcohol. He stepped into his unmarked cruiser, not noticing the two black SUVs parked a few cars down. The last thing he saw was a pair of gloved hands grabbing him from behind. There was no struggle, no fight, just the cold, suffocating silence of a man who thought he was above it all. The phantoms weren't there to kill him. That wasn't the point. Instead, they took him to an abandoned building on the outskirts of the city, a place where no one would hear him scream. The air inside was thick with the smell of old decay, and the only light came from a single, flickering bulb overhead. Carson's arms were tied to a chair, and his face was bruised from the rough handling. He was still groggy, his mind racing as he tried to figure out what was going on. "What's this about?" Carson slurred, his voice shaky. "You think you're gonna get away with this?" Jay stepped forward, his eyes cold. "No, Carson," he said, his voice calm. "I'm not gonna get away with anything. The phantoms had set up a camera, one that was already rolling, capturing every moment of the interrogation. The plan was simple: humiliate Carson, expose him for who he really was, and make sure the world knew it. Jay didn't say much during the exchange. He didn't need to. The phantoms had everything they needed: the documents showing history of planting evidence, the testimony of his victims, and the numerous cases where he had covered his tracks. They had been collecting it all for weeks. But the piece de resistance was the final piece: the confession. They made Carson admit to every crime he had committed, every lie, every frame, every moment of corruption that had allowed him to stay untouchable. And when he finally cracked, when his voice shook with fear and shame, Jay knew it was time. "Say it," Jay demanded. "Say what you've done." Carson hesitated, but then the words tumbled out of him. "I planted drugs on kids," he mumbled, his voice barely audible. "I framed them. I did it for the money, for the power." Jay leaned in closer. "Say their names. Say the people you hurt." Carson's face went pale. "I don't remember them all." Jay's voice cut through the room like a blade. "You will remember, Carson. You'll remember every single one of them, because this is what happens when you destroy people's lives for your own gain." The confession was enough. The phantoms had what they needed. Jay turned to leave the room, but not before he gave Carson one last look. "You're going to disappear now," he said coldly. "And when you do, everyone will know why." The phantoms didn't just kill the cops. They didn't just shoot their enemies in cold blood. No, they went after the system, piece by piece, and exposed it for the rotting, corrupted machine that it was. The phantoms knew that power didn't lie in weapons or violence. It lay in control, in exposure, and in the end, it was the truth that would be their weapon. As expected, the city exploded with tension. The news outlets couldn't ignore it. The video footage of Carson's confession spread like wildfire, leaked to the press and shared across social media. The police scrambled to cover their tracks, but it was too late. The damage was done, and with Carson's fall came the revelation of more officers, more corruption, and more lies. The reaction from the police was swift. They went into overdrive, trying to control the narrative, trying to keep the truth from getting out. But the Phantoms were always one step ahead. They had already planned their next move. Within hours, a second officer, Sergeant Thompson, was exposed for his involvement in framing suspects. Then a detective, a man named Walters, was revealed to have been running a private gambling ring that involved police officers and civilians alike. The chain reaction was unstoppable. The police were unraveling from the inside. They had never been this exposed, this vulnerable. The power that they had once wielded so easily was slipping through their fingers, and they didn't know who to trust anymore. The city was on edge, and Jay could feel it. He could feel the shift in the air. The balance of power was starting to tip, and the Phantoms were standing at the top, watching it all unfold. But even as Jay reveled in their victories, he felt the weight of what they had done. He had crossed a line, and there was no going back. The vengeance that had driven him, that had driven them all, had taken them to a place where the line between justice and retribution was blurred beyond recognition. Jay felt it in his bones. He was becoming the very thing he had once feared. He wasn't the quiet, calm leader that Malik had been. He wasn't the man who had chosen to fight with precision and patience. He had let his anger take control, and now it was consuming him. But there was no time for reflection. There was no time for second thoughts. The war was still raging, and Jay wasn't about to back down now. They had come this far. They couldn't stop until the system had been broken completely. The Phantoms weren't just fighting for revenge anymore. They were fighting for survival, and the city was beginning to realize that the price of justice was about to come with a heavy cost. The real question was, how far would the Phantoms go to make sure that price was paid? It wasn't just about taking down corrupt cops. It was about exposing the truth, making the people who had been living in fear finally feel the weight of their actions. And with every strike, every expose, the Phantoms were getting closer to something much bigger than anyone had anticipated. The war had only just begun. But with each calculated move, Jay and the Phantoms were making sure that when it ended, wouldn't be the system that came out on top. It would be them that, and the city wasn't ready for what came next. The city was burning, but not in the way the cops had expected. They had thought the fire would come in the form of chaos, looting, protests, violence. They had prepared for that. But they hadn't prepared for the fire to burn quietly, for it to simmer and rise beneath the surface, undetected, until it was too late to stop. Jay had been leading the Phantoms with a single goal in mind: expose the truth, break the system, and make them feel the weight of Malik's death. And now, the fire that had been quietly growing for weeks was about to consume everything. It started with the leak. It wasn't a single video, it was a flood. Dozens of videos, thousands of documents, all carefully curated, all showing the officers who had been involved in Malik's murder, and worse. Each video exposed more than just the corrupt cops who had been involved in planting evidence, falsifying reports, and framing innocent men and women for crimes they didn't commit. It was the entire system that was corrupt. It was the entire department that had been working in tandem to keep their power unchecked, their actions invisible. The Phantoms weren't just attacking the police anymore. They were attacking the very foundation that the city had been built on. They were showing the world the truth that had been buried in the dark for so long. And when the first video went viral, a shaky, grainy clip showing Officer Carson's confession, his voice trembling with fear and shame, the floodgates opened. The footage spread quickly, first through underground message boards and encrypted channels, then into the mainstream. The confession of Officer Carson was just the beginning. Soon, videos of other officers came to light, detectives, sergeants, lieutenants, all confessing to the same crimes. The Phantoms had done more than just make noise. They had turned the police department into a rotting corpse, its secrets spilling out for everyone to see. The public response was not one of chaos, but one of quiet defiance. The streets didn't riot. They didn't burn with the kind of rage that had been expected. No, the people reacted with something far more dangerous: silence. They stood on corners and stoops, watching the videos, reading the articles, their eyes hard with the knowledge that they had known, deep down, that the police had been corrupt for years. But now, it wasn't just a rumor. It wasn't just whispers in the dark. Now, it was out in the open, undeniable, and they could see it for what it was. And with that silence came a shift. People started to move differently. They started to act with purpose. The first signs of protest were subtle. They weren't the usual marches or chants. They didn't flood the streets with anger. Instead, people began to gather in small, quiet groups, sitting together on stoops or in coffee shops, watching the videos, sharing information. The protests began not with signs, but with conversations. The people were no longer afraid to speak. They were no longer afraid of the consequences. They were done with the silence that had been imposed on them for so long that as the videos continued to spread, the public's anger grew, but it wasn't a blind rage. It was a quiet, calculated fury. They knew the police would try to cover it up. They knew the system would try to fight back. But for the first time, the city felt something it hadn't felt in years. Hope. The protests didn't get loud until they had to. By the time the federal investigations began, the public had already won. The streets were no longer afraid to speak the truth. They were speaking it loudly, clearly, and they were demanding justice. Jay watched as the city changed. Before his eyes, the cops who once strutted through the streets with a sense of power, with the belief that they were untouchable, now hid in fear. They didn't patrol the same neighborhoods anymore. They didn't walk with their heads held high. They looked over their shoulders, knowing that the people were watching them. They knew the truth was out, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. But even as Jay watched the collapse of the system unfold, even as the city seemed to rise in protest and revolt, he couldn't shake the feeling that something inside him had broken. Jay had made his move. But now, as the Phantoms continued their calculated campaign, as they exposed the officers one by one, Jay began to see the cost of what he had done. The war he had fought for, the vengeance he had exacted for his brother's death, had come at a price. He had crossed a line that he wasn't sure he could come back from. When Malik was alive, Jay had looked up to him. He had admired the calmness with which his brother moved through the world, the way he always seemed to have control. Malik had never acted out of impulse. He had never let his emotions drive his decisions. He had been a leader, steady and calculated, and that was why the gang had followed him. That was why they had respected him. But Jay, he wasn't like that. He wasn't calm. He wasn't steady. He was driven by the anger that burned inside him, the anger that had grown after Malik's death, the anger that had pushed him to take the reins of the Phantoms and lead them down a path of vengeance. And now, as the videos of Carson, Walters, and the others continued to circulate, Jay couldn't help but wonder, was this really the way Malik would have done it? Would Malik have taken the same route, using the Phantom's power to expose the truth, to bring down the police system piece by piece? Or had he, too, become something else entirely? The war that Jay had fought for was no longer just about Malik. It was no longer just about revenge for the man who had raised him, who had protected him, and who had been taken from him too soon. Now, it was about Jay himself. It was about the man he had become. He had followed in his brother's footsteps, but not in the way he had imagined. Malik had always known when to fight, when to pull back, when to act with precision. Jay had done the same, but the precision had been lost in the chaos of his emotions. He had allowed his grief, his anger, to drive him, and now he was losing sight of everything he had once believed in. As the city descended into its own quiet revolution, Jay found himself at the heart of it, the leader of the Phantoms. But the man he saw in the mirror wasn't the same one he had admired in his brother, and that scared him. The response from the police was swift, but it wasn't what Jay had expected. The department didn't fight back with force. They didn't try to take the Phantoms down with weapons or intimidation. Instead, they tried to cover their tracks. They tried to bury the truth. The problem was, the truth had already been exposed. There were no more lies the police could tell, no more ways they could cover up their actions. The damage was done. Officers were arrested, placed under federal investigation. Officers who had once felt untouchable now found themselves in handcuffs, escorted through the streets by federal agents. The power had shifted, but it wasn't the police who had the upper hand anymore. Jay watched it all unfold. The system he had spent his entire life fighting against finally collapsing, but he didn't feel the victory he had expected. He didn't feel like he had won. He didn't feel like the Phantoms had won. Because the cost of this victory was too high. The war had taken more than just lives. It had taken Jay's soul. He had crossed a line that he couldn't uncross. He had become a man he didn't recognize, a man consumed by vengeance, a man who had forgotten what it meant to lead with calm, with purpose. But even as the city began to heal, even as the police department fell apart, Jay couldn't help but wonder if there was any way to turn back. Was this the path Malik would have taken? Was this the path he had to follow, or was it just the only way forward now? The silence that followed the storm was deafening. The city had changed, and so had Jay, but the question still lingered. Had they won the war, or had they lost something far more valuable in the process? The streets were quieter now. The protests had turned into discussions, into meetings. The damage was done, but Jay didn't feel the triumph that everyone else did. He only felt the weight of what he had lost, and in that silence he realized something. The war wasn't over. It had just begun. The city was quiet. The kind of quiet that makes your skin crawl, the kind that feels like a breath held too long, a pause before something even bigger arrives. It wasn't the silence of peace, it was the silence of something broken, a city that had been stretched thin for too long, a city that had watched the rot fester in its core was now waiting for the pieces to fall. The weight of the truth had finally become too much to bear. Jay sat at the edge of a rooftop. The skyline stretched out before him, watching as the last vestiges of the sun disappeared behind the crumbling buildings. The streets, once alive with the thrum of street races, corner deals, and shouted orders, were now eerily still. A few cars passed by here and there, but it was nothing compared to what it had been just weeks ago. The protests had stopped, replaced now by a quiet disillusionment. The cameras were still on, the city still running, but the heart of it had slowed. The foundation of the system, the one that had supported everything for so long, was finally cracking under the weight of the truth. Jay's mind raced, his thoughts tangled in the mess of everything that had happened. The phantoms had struck fear into the police, had forced the truth into the open, but at what cost? The faces of those they had exposed were becoming just names. Now cops arrested, officers disgraced, the department in turmoil, but was that enough? The system had been wounded, yes, but it wasn't dead. Not yet, and Jay couldn't shake the feeling that something still lingered in the air, something still hadn't been fixed. The war had ended, but the fight had only just begun. Malik's name had become a symbol, but not of the gang that had once followed him. No, Malik's legacy had taken on a new life, one far bigger than the phantoms, far bigger than the violence that had been wrought in his name. His name now stood for something else. It was a symbol of change, of a city that had finally started to see the rot, and was now trying to heal itself. But healing was hard. Healing took time. And the wound the phantoms had ripped open in the heart of the city wasn't going to be closed with a few arrests or a few public apologies. The scars were deeper than that. Jay had watched the streets shift, watched the balance of power start to tilt. The police were no longer the untouchables. The media no longer spun their lies unchecked. People were no longer afraid to speak. But what had it cost them? What had it cost him? He had gotten what he wanted. The truth had come to light, and the city had started to change. But as Jay sat there, his eyes locked on the fading skyline, he couldn't help but wonder if the price was too high. The phone buzzed in his pocket, breaking the silence, but Jay didn't pick it up. He already knew who it was, K-Dub or maybe Fat Mike. They had all been checking in on him, watching his every move since the operation had finished. They all wanted to know the same thing. What now? They had won, but Jay couldn't find any satisfaction in it. Every victory felt like a hollow one. His brother's death had been avenged, but at what cost? He stood up from the rooftop and walked toward the door, the city streets still silent beneath him. He was on autopilot, the familiar motion of his steps dragging him toward a place he knew he had to be, but didn't want to go. He found himself standing in front of Malik's grave at the cemetery just outside the city. It was a quiet place, a place that had once felt like a sanctuary, a place where he could come to think, to reflect, but now, it felt like an empty shell. He hadn't been here since Malik's funeral. He hadn't been able to bring himself to face it until now. The grave was simple, a small headstone with Malik's name etched in bold letters, a symbol of a life cut short. It was nothing grand, nothing flashy, but it didn't need to be. Malik's life hadn't been about grand gestures. It had been about staying alive, staying smart, keeping the family together. Jay stood in front of the grave, his hands buried deep in his jacket pockets. He didn't say anything. He couldn't. The words that had been burning in his chest for so long, the anger, the frustration, the grief, all of it felt irrelevant now. There was no point in speaking. Malik wasn't here to hear it. And the war that they had fought together, the battles they had waged side by side, had ended, but not in victory. No, it had ended in something else entirely. Jay reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper, a note from Malik's old crew. It had been left for him at the funeral. One last message. Jay had never read it until now. He unfolded the paper, reading the words written in Malik's familiar handwriting. You're going to carry it now. Keep it steady, and don't lose sight of what matters. But remember, this life doesn't care about who's right. It only cares about who's left. Don't let it swallow you whole. Jay held the paper in his hands for a moment before he let it fall onto the ground. His eyes followed it as the wind gently carried it away. For the first time in what felt like forever, Jay's mind was clear. The weight of the war, the weight of his decisions, the weight of his anger and grief, it had all started to lift. He wasn't sure where he stood anymore, but he knew one thing. He wasn't the same person he had been. He wasn't the leader Malik had been, but maybe that wasn't such a bad thing. Jay turned away from the grave and walked toward the city. He didn't need to look back. The phantoms would continue their work, the city would continue to change, and the fight would go on. But for Jay, the battle wasn't about winning anymore. It was about survival, his own survival, and the survival of the people who still believed in the idea of change. He wasn't sure what role he would play in that change, but he knew it wouldn't be with a gun in his hand or with vengeance. In his heart, as he walked through the city streets, Jay looked up at the skyline, the lights flickering in the distance. He wasn't leading a gang anymore. He wasn't just a soldier in a war that had cost so much. He was part of something bigger. Now, something that wasn't about violence, or revenge, or anger. It was about the quiet steps that needed to be taken to rebuild what had been broken. It was about rebuilding a city that had fallen apart, piece by piece, and making sure that it stayed whole this time. Jay wasn't leading a revolution anymore. He was part of it, and maybe, just maybe, that was all he needed to be. He turned the corner and disappeared into the streets. No longer a leader of the phantoms, but a part of the city that would change it. Silent steps, quiet action. And this time, it wasn't about revenge, it was about peace. The war was over, but the work had only just begun.